What's up, Packer fans? Welcome back to another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. Today is our third and final part of our three-part series. 2 days ago, we went over why the Chicago Bears do in fact still suck. Yesterday, we went over why the Minnesota Vikings have the bleakest future of all the teams in the NFC North. And today, we have our toughest assignment yet, and that's why the Detroit Lions will fail in 2023. This is a tougher one. They're a good football team. They have a lot of positives, a lot of things going in their favor, but there are some things that I think can potentially hold this team back in 2023. In 2022, they were the young, the pesky, the talented, the hungry, the upstart Detroit Lions, a team that we haven't seen out of Detroit in a very long time. And the ankle-biting Dan Campbell's really got that team headed in the right direction and playing a very good brand of football that ultimately ended with them ahead of the Green Bay Packers a season ago in the standings with an actual winning record and with things really headed in the right direction. Now, they ended with a 9-8 record, but this was very opposite of the Bears and the Vikings, where the Bears had a few wins early and then reeled off 10 consecutive losses at the end of the year. The Vikings, they started 8-1 and then, finished the season, I think 5-4, 4-3, whatever it was. But basically did not finish the season the same way as they started. It was 5-4, by the way. And then the Detroit Lions are the exact opposite of that. So they started last season 1-6 in their first 7 games. And the Fighting Dan Campbells looked anything but. And this looked like it was going to be your same old Detroit Lions that were just bottom-feeding division team and had no chance of really putting things together. And then, in their last 10 games, they were 8-2. 8 wins, 2 losses, including 2 wins against your Green Bay Packers, and including an elimination game against the Packers where they eliminated the Packers from the playoffs. I don't need to go over that again. You know that very, very well. The only 2 losses that they had in those 10 games was a surprising loss to the Carolina Panthers, which ultimately cost them a playoff spot last year. And then a loss to the Buffalo Bills, which is nothing, to be ashamed of. They lost 28-25 to the Bills. They were very competitive in that game. So 8-2 with a near loss to the Bills and then a kind of surprising loss to the Carolina Panthers. That was it in their last 10 games. In addition, in those 8 games from a season ago that they did lose, all right, so they're 9-8 on the season. In those 8 games, 5 of them were by a combined 17 points. So even in their 8 losses, there were 3 of them that they got beat pretty handily, but the other 5 were extremely close and they were competitive in those games as well. In a play here or there, and things might look a lot different for your 2022 Detroit Lions. Now, this, again, unlike Minnesota, unlike Chicago, really felt in the second half of the season like it was a team on the rise. And the big question coming up is going to be, can they continue that? And can they actually stack success, the old Mike McCarthyism, season to season, which is something that has really avoided the Detroit Lions through, their entire history of their career, or their franchise, excuse me. Their rankings are interesting and not all that different from the Minnesota Vikings, at least on a parallel sort of level. Offensively, extremely good. 5th in points per game with 26.6 points per game. 4th in yards per game with 380 yards per game. 5th in points per play. 4th in yards per play. 4th in red zone scoring percentage. 5th in touchdowns per game. 11th in rushing yards per game. 5th in passing yards per game. 5th in yards per pass, 8th in passing yards per game, 1st in interception percentage. So Jared Goff did a tremendous job taking care of the football, and 3rd in sack percentage. So all the way around, rushing offense, passing offense, turnover percentage, sack percentage, 3rd down percentage, whatever metric that you want to look at, red zone percentage, they were really, really good at. That was a fantastic Lions offense in 2022. The defense, the exact opposite. And I never really realized, by the way, that the Lions, the Bears, and the Vikings all had bottom 4 defenses in the NFL a season ago until I started putting this series together. I would not have projected going in that it was actually the Packers who had by far and away the best defense in 2022. Go figure. But anyway, I digress. The defense last year for the Lions, 28th in points allowed per game with 25.1 points per game, 32nd in yards per game, the worst defense yardage-wise a season ago, 32nd in yards per play, 30th in third down defense, 26th in red zone defense, 30th in rushing defense, 31st in yards per pass allowed, 18th in interception percentage, 18th in sack percentage. Across the board, awful on defense. Pass defense, run defense, no matter what way you want to look at it, this was a very bad Detroit Lions defense in 2022. They were 5th in turnover margin, including the least amount of giveaways in the entire NFL. That is one reason for potential regression this year. It is very hard to do that over and over and just consistently take great care of the football. Sometimes that's just luck, and sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way. We'll see if that can continue for the Lions in 2023. And then they were overall a top 5 penalty yardage team. So overall a very, very good Detroit Lions team. So there's a lot that you would ultimately like. Turnover percentage, penalty percentage. Offensively, it's the defense that ultimately is going to have to get fixed, and they have to kind of keep everything else the same if they want to actually take that step in 2023. From a coaching change standpoint, not a ton of changes. John Fox comes in as a defensive assistant, so the longtime NFL head coach will come in to help and try and shore up that defense a little bit. Aaron Glenn, the defensive coordinator there. So we'll see if that amounts to any changes with how they actually scheme up their defense, but not a ton of changes overall, which you wouldn't expect. This was a very good season from Detroit last year, and you would have expected them to carry things over. Ben Johnson stays on as offensive coordinator, and we'll see what ultimately this, if the scheme changes on defense a little bit with John Fox there, but overall, not a ton of changes from a coaching standpoint. As far as players added, players lost, etc., they really remade their secondary. They go out and get Cameron Sutton, the corner from Pittsburgh. They get Chauncey Gardner-Johnson from the Eagles, which I think is going to be a huge pickup for them. They sign Emmanuel Mosley from the San Francisco 49ers. They pick up David Montgomery, the running back from the Bears, Marvin Jones Jr., Alex Anzalone, the linebacker, Isaiah Buggs, Jermaine Ifedi. That's their, the players that they added this offseason. The players they lost DJ Chark, the speedy wide receiver on the outside. They lose Jamal Williams, Deshaun Elliott, the safety, Mike Hughes and Jeff Okudah, the corners. Hughes free agency, Jeff Okudah was traded. So they definitely wanted to make over that secondary. It's interesting that they didn't really do it via the draft. In fact, they didn't draft a single defensive back. They did go out, however, in free agency and spend that money by getting Cameron Sutton, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and Emmanuel Mosley. So just like the Minnesota Vikings completely tore down and reshaped their secondary, at least their cornerback room, the Detroit Lions did basically the exact same thing at their cornerback room, moving on from Hughes and Okudah and bringing in Sutton, Gardner-Johnson, and Mosley. In the draft, they draft Jahmyr Gibbs, the running back out of Alabama, and he is going to be a dynamic and explosive player for them. We could have the whole conversation as to whether or not drafting a running back at pick 12 is smart in today's modern NFL. That's a good conversation. The other conversation is it's awesome to have really good football players, explosive, dynamic, playmaking football players, and Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be that, and he is going to be a pain at running back to contain. I expect him to be able to come in and have a massive season from year one, so I think that's going to be a big pickup for the Lions. We can have almost the exact same identical argument about Jack Campbell, their 18th overall pick. I'll start by saying, when I had watched all the prospects prior to the draft, two of my favorite players in this draft, bar none, were Jahmyr Gibbs and Jack Campbell. Loved both of them. And then it's just the philosophical approach of all right, I love both of these players. At what point do you start valuing them? Because running back and off-ball linebacker, not your traditionally valued positions in today's modern NFL. The Lions said, screw it. We think they're amazing football players. And they went out and grabbed them. And you can almost make that argument for their first 4 picks at tight end. Same thing. Tight end, not a super valued position. At least it hasn't paid off a lot of times early in the draft. We're going to see this is a phenomenal tight end class. And Detroit had a lot of options on the table, including Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft, who the Packers selected. They go with Sam Laporta at pick 34. And then Brian Branch, another position, safety, a little bit undervalued at times. They get arguably the best safety in the draft at pick 45. So they go out, they say, screw positional value. They got 4 talented football players, 4 players that I know, specifically Brian Branch and Sam Laporta, a lot of Packer fans were hoping for in the second round with, their 2 second-round picks. Jack Campbell was a player that I think the Packers, a lot of Packer fans had their eye on, maybe in round 2. The Lions obviously get him in round 1. But overall, 4 players that I really, really liked in Gibbs, Campbell, Laporta, and Branch. It's just, again, the argument about positional value. But there's zero question to me that those 4 players are going to be able to come in and compete and have a role on this team and to me, play very good football for the Lions almost immediately. They then get a potential, down the road quarterback in Hendon Hooker, a little bit overaged, but certainly a super talented quarterback, and if nothing else, should provide valuable depth for Jared Goff. Broderick Martin, the defensive lineman. You get Colby Sorsadal, the tackle, and then wide receiver Antoine Green to round things out. But it was really those first 5 picks, specifically Gibbs, Campbell, Laporta, Branch, and Hooker, that are ultimately going to make or break that Detroit Lions draft class, and like a lot of those picks overall. When we start looking at the depth chart for the Lions, it gets a little bit more interesting. So at quarterback, Jared Goff, and I think the big question here for Jared Goff is going to be, can he repeat what he did a season ago? Jared Goff was really good a season ago, which I think is, it was surprising to a lot of people. Extremely efficient as a passer. He fit extremely well within Ben Johnson's offense. And now the question is going to be, can he repeat that in 2023? At running back, you jettison Jamal Williams. You bring in David Montgomery. From a talent standpoint, that should basically even itself out. You can maybe even make the argument that maybe Montgomery is a little bit more talented. Then you also go out and get Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think the 1-2 punch of Montgomery and Gibbs is going to be fantastic. Montgomery is a tackle breaker. He's able to run through people. Jahmyr Gibbs is I know he's like a 4.3 40 guy, I think. He looks like a 4.2 40 guy. He is insanely fast, and he will make everyone look stupid. It looks like they're taking good angles to the football, and then Jahmyr Gibbs just runs right by them. At wide receiver, I think this is going to be the interesting one. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the most underrated, underappreciated players in the league. And I know he's appreciated very much so. He still doesn't get the credit he deserves. He is maybe the most consistent player in the league. He performs every single Sunday at a very high level, and you can basically chalk him up for 7 or 8 catches and almost 100 yards, like seemingly every given week. Phenomenal football players. Then it gets a little bit more dicey. Marvin Jones, Josh Reynolds, Khalif Raymond, Antoine Green, their 7th round pick, Trinity Benson from Denver. They get it's just not a super sexy group of wide receivers after that. We'll talk about the one other one in just a moment. They bring in Sam Laporta at tight end. A little bit interesting that they trade away TJ Hawkinson, and then, the tight end out of Iowa, they trade him to Minnesota for, pennies on the dollar. And then they draft Sam Laporta, tight end out of Iowa, in the 2nd round. But he should be a good fit in the offense, and I think he's going to be a very good tight end. Their offensive line, Taylor Decker, Jonah Jackson, Frank Ragnow, Big V, and Penei Sewell. Very good offensive line a season ago. Don't expect that to change. They got Graham Glasgow and Logan Sternberg. Stenberg. I was right. Those are their 2 backups. Even Matt Nelson's provided some depth at some time, so they have pretty decent depth along their offensive line. Defensive line, I think, is their big question. John Kaminsky, Isaiah Buggs, Aleem McNeil, Christian Covington, Broderick Martin, they get in the 3rd round. They do still have Levi and Wuzurike. We'll see if he can finally take a step. They're 21 2nd round pick who hasn't done much. They've got some okay talent there, but it hasn't amounted to much. And I think that's going to be a pretty good question mark. Josh Pascal, their 2nd round pick from a season ago. We'll see what he can do. But then they've got their edge rushers. You've got Aiden Hutchinson, who I think is going to take another step this year. Obviously Pascal is a part of that as well. You've got Charles Harris, Romeo Okwara, Julian Okwara, James Houston, who took a pretty had a really nice rookie season last year. So they've got some talent there. And I think obviously Aiden Hutchinson and what he can bring to the table is going to be super important. They have 2 tackling machines in Jack Campbell and then Malcolm Rodriguez. They bring in Alex Anzalone. They have Derek Barnes as a backup. And then we talked about that remade secondary. Emmanuel Mosley and Cameron Sutton are going to be your new outside corners. I would expect Chauncey Gardner-Johnson to be their nickel slot guy. You've got Kirby Joseph at safety. Kirby Joseph, who almost picked off Aaron Rodgers in that last game 3 times a season ago, ended up with, 1 or 2 of them? I forget what it was. I think he had 1 called back, 1 dropped maybe, and then 1 that actually stuck. Either way, and he had a really good game against Green Bay in that final week. And then Tracy Walker, also a huge fan of Afatu Melifonwu. I'm hoping that he can stay healthy this year for Detroit, not from a Packers standpoint, but from an NFL standpoint. But overall, this is a pretty deep, talented team. Jack Fox, Riley Patterson, Scott Daly, they're specialists. Nothing major to write home about there, but overall, a well-rounded Detroit team outside of wide receiver, defensive line. I think there's certainly some question marks there, but that is going to be a deep team that should be able to compete at a very high level this upcoming season. When you look at what opposing teams are afraid of, it starts with Amon-Ra St. Brown, and maybe not to the same level when we talked about, the Minnesota Vikings and Justin Jefferson, but you have to be keenly aware of where Amon-Ra St. Brown is at all times. And he just has that way, like an odd way of just sort of sneaking up on you. Like if you're like labeling Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's a really good route runner, right? But it's not like he's insanely explosive. It's not like he's going to out jump you for a ball. It's not like he's just so freaking good. Like, and he just kind of sneaks up on you. You're not expecting him. Like you just kind of look at him. You're like, oh, that guy's not going to do much. And then all of a sudden, like I said, he's got like 8 catches for 140 yards and 2 touchdowns. And you're like, all right, well that guy just ruined the entire game for the opposing team. So he's 1A that has to be on your list for players to stop. Aiden Hutchinson, the other one. I do think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a very big problem from a running back standpoint with his speed and explosiveness. I think they're going to use him a little bit too as sort of a gadget guy. I think you'll see him lined up in the slot a little bit. They're going to use him in some creative ways. And offensive coordinator Ben Johnson, I think, is going to use him very, very wisely and make sure that they're getting the ball in his hands. And then Penei Sewell becoming one of the best offensive tackles as expected when he was a rookie coming out. He is a phenomenal football player as well. And that offensive line as a whole, very, very sound. So I think that's where it starts. Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sewell, and Aiden Hutchinson are the players that if you're an opposing team, you have to be keenly aware of what they're doing, where they're at, and just figure out a way to stop them. And again, with Sewell, it's not like so much where's he going to line up sort of thing, but just like how can we beat this guy? How can we make sure that he's not devastating us from a run blocking standpoint? Aiden Hutchinson, they can move all around, and that makes things more complicated. And then how they're going to use Amon-Ra and Jahmyr Gibbs, lining them up everywhere, making it challenging to stop. Those are the 4 that I think you again have to be super aware of and find ways to take them out of the game and make other players from the Lions beat you in some capacity. I think the big question here for Detroit is going to ultimately be how much better can they be on defense? I think it starts with Aiden Hutchinson, right? This is a massively talented football player. If he can take a big step, then all of a sudden he's just a complete game wrecker. That's going to change this Detroit Lions defense. If he's kind of exactly what he was a season ago, a really good player, but maybe not quite great yet, then I think that defense probably stays kind of the same. And then the next question becomes, how good can that remade secondary be? You didn't draft anyone. Your safeties, I think, should be okay carrying over from a season ago. But the corners, I think, are the really big questions. I think Chauncey Gardner-Johnson's going to help a lot. Cam Sutton, Emmanuel Mosley, good corners, maybe not great corners, but they know how to win in this league. And then, I think the question then becomes, how big is that jump? If they are better, like they were 28th, right, in defense a season ago from a point production standpoint. If they move to 25th, that's not good enough. They're still going to be kind of the same Detroit Lions. If they move to 20th, if they move to 18th, 15th, like if they're in that range, that's a pretty significant jump for a team that has one of the top offenses and a team that, wins the turnover battle, isn't super penalized. Like overall, you feel good about that team if all of a sudden they make that jump into a top 15 defense. But if they're still in the bottom third of the league, then this is probably going to be a similar Detroit Lions team to what you saw from a season ago. The reason I think, offensively, that we have to talk about as well, you have Amon-Ra St. Brown, and then, from a weapon standpoint, how much is Laporta going to give you as a rookie tight end? Marvin Jones, Reynolds, it's not super sexy. And that brings in the big question, and I think really the biggest X factor for the Lions, and that's Jameson Williams, who is right now suspended because of the gambling issues. So he's going to miss part of the season and then come back. I think he misses first 6-8 games. I didn't look it up beforehand, my apologies, but he doesn't miss the whole season. So he's going to come back at some point. And then what can he bring to the table? This is a massively dynamic player, one of my favorite players coming out of that draft. You saw some flashes from him a season ago once he got healthy, but he's going to be, he's going to be healthy coming into the season. Once he's ready to go coming off his suspension, he's going to be fresh and he is fast as hell. So the question is going to be if he can be that massive dynamic playmaker opposite Amon-Ra St. Brown, that could give the Detroit Lions a massive boost in the second half of the season. If he's not that, if he's not what they expected coming out and he just doesn't hit the ground running and run on all cylinders and be that playmaking explosive weapon, then that's going to limit what that Detroit Lions offense can ultimately be. And I have a ton of trust in Ben Johnson and what he's going to be able to do regardless. But I think to me, the biggest X factor for them by far and away is going to be Jameson Williams and what he can do once he comes back. The other thing here is they were a team that snuck up on everyone a season ago. And specifically that Ben Johnson offense was new and fresh, but now teams are going to have, studied that offense a lot through this offseason and what they were able to do to be so effective a season ago. And that's going to set up probably defenses a little bit better to defend them. And it's going to be up to Ben Johnson and that Detroit Lions offense to really make it so that they're creating something new and it's not just the same thing that they put on paper a season ago. Can Jared Goff be as good as he was a season ago? How much can Sam Laporta and Jahmyr Gibbs as rookies add to this offense? I think it's going to be significant, especially with Gibbs, but we talk about it with Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft as well. It's really difficult for tight ends to come in and make a big impact, and they need Laporta at that tight end position to be an impact player for them. As mentioned, I don't think this team is sneaking up on anyone anymore. I think last year you looked at it, especially the way they started the season, it was kind of like, all right, same old Detroit Lions. And then all of a sudden they were blowing by people, specifically on offense. And I think teams are not going to be caught as off guard by that this upcoming season. So Detroit's going to have to work a little bit harder for that. As mentioned, was Jared Goff fool's gold? Can he continue what he did a season ago? And then I think the other two things here that would maybe give me some cause for concern. You had all the gambling issues, and they released the majority of the players that had the issues. I think actually the only one left on the team that is still there is Jameson Williams. To be clear, I'm not concerned that the Detroit Lions have some big issue, like some big gambling ring they're running in their locker room, or that it's going to continue to be a problem. Nothing like that whatsoever. But I am a believer in, like, sometimes you start getting hints for how a season is going to trend in some way. And like, you want to be like, everything wants to be positive and good news. And if you start having negative stuff start leaking out and that starts seeping into a locker room, like, it just, like, sometimes things just get off on the wrong foot. The last thing that the Detroit Lions wanted this offseason was this sort of gambling issue that's kind of surrounding them, and they continued, or they've had players suspended. Jameson Williams is going to miss games. So I don't, like, the thing's not super concerning to me, but like just a little bit of that, like, bubbling up, like it's not getting the season off on the right foot, right? And losing Jameson Williams is certainly a huge net negative for the Lions as they kick off this season. And then the other thing I'll say too is, I think losing Jamal Williams is semi-significant. Like, I think people forget, Jamal Williams for David Montgomery, from a talent standpoint on the field, especially adding Jahmyr Gibbs as well, like that, they're going to be better at running back from a talent standpoint than they were a season ago. So losing Jamal Williams on paper, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. No question about it. But Jamal Williams is a heart and soul of a football team. Packer fans can speak to that as well. His energy is infectious. His positivity is infectious. Like, there is something about that dude that just brings energy, positivity, and winning to a team. And I think losing him is going to be a little bit more detrimental to the Lions than I think maybe some team will, than maybe that their team ultimately expects and some people ultimately expect. So I think that is going to be a loss for them. Now, like I said, talent-wise on the field, Gibbs and Montgomery replacing him, they're going to be just fine. But that presence, like, there's just something there that you can't replace, and I think Green Bay has found that as well. Lions can easily win the division. The Lions have the highest floor of any of the four teams, in my opinion, and would be the most surprised if they finished last in the division of all the teams. I've said for many episodes now, I think anything can happen in the NFC North this season. Lions, Bears, Vikings, Packers, if any of them won the North, I think it's at least within the realm of possibility. Lions, Bears, Packers, Vikings, could any of them lose the North? I think it's within the realm of possibility. But of all those things that would surprise me, the most surprising would probably be the Bears winning the North, and the most surprising on the other side would be the Lions losing the North. I think if you said the Bears were number one in the North and the Lions were fourth in the North, that would be the most shocking thing to me. I think anything else is kind of in the realm of possibility. Those two would probably be the most shocking, just because I think the Lions have a lot of talent on this team. Even if like a Jared Goff would go down, at least you have a Hendon Hooker now who can maybe keep things afloat, and you've got everything else you kind of need on that offense to kind of make things going. So they would be a surprise fourth finish. Like I said, I think they have the highest floor of any of the teams in this division. But I am struggling to put an argument together as to why this team can make a significant jump from a season ago. Jameson Williams may be coming back and making a much bigger impact. Sure, that could help. Can Laporta and Gibbs be more explosive playmakers on offense? Yes, but this offense was already really good a season ago. Maybe they get a little bit better, but I think that's going to be a tall task just based on how good they were a season ago. And then defensively, yes, I think Aiden Hutchinson can be better. Maybe the remade secondary will help some things. It certainly is not going to hurt. Adding Jack Campbell on the second level will help. Like, there's some things that this team did, but their defensive line, not super great. I still think they're going to have some issues in the secondary. And this was more of like a overarching issue in Detroit. Like, their brand of defense was just very bad. So I think all of a sudden becoming a top 15 defense is going to be a little bit out of reach. So maybe their offense is the same, and maybe their defense goes from 28th to 20th. And I think that's significant. And I think that potentially puts Detroit maybe in a 10-7 sort of situation. But that big significant jump where all of a sudden they're 13-4 and competing in NFC Championship games or things like that, that's the argument that I'm really struggling to put together as to why Detroit can make a massive jump in 2023. And if I had to bet, as a observer of the Detroit Lions for 38, 39 years of my life, if I had to bet, either the Lions take a huge surge in a positive direction or a franchise that usually takes one step forward and two steps back, if they repeat that process like they have through the course of their franchise history, I'd probably come a little bit closer to saying they probably take a little bit of a step back. Now, like I said, Detroit Lions fans, if you're listening to this, I like your team. I really, really do. You are by far and away the most likable team in the division, not named the Green Bay Packers. If it can't be the Packers winning the division, all Packer fans would hope that it is you winning the division. And yeah, so there's a lot to like about your team. There's no question about it. This is the hardest episode to put together. There's not much to drag about where your franchise is at right now. I do think, though, that this season is going to be more challenging than Lions fans expect it to be. And maybe Lions fans expect it just because they always expect bad things out of the Detroit Lions. But I think just having to repeat what they did a season ago, stacking that success. Can they do the same thing on offense? Defenses are going to have studied Ben Johnson and what he did on offense this past season. Can Jared Goff put it all back together? Can their defense actually take a legitimate step? I think there's going to be some challenges for the Lions. They're going to have a tougher schedule than they did a season ago. So all those things will come into play. I like the Lions. I think they're probably favorites to finish first in the NFC North. I think they're probably favorites, the least likely team to finish last in the NFC North. And I just think things are going to be a little bit harder. So tough to put this one together and drag them entirely. But I don't think if you're looking for a high-end play for the Detroit Lions and saying like, hey, they're going to be easy, top-end division winners and they're like just going to run away with this thing, I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think this team is going to face a few more challenges than that in 2023. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. Be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.